you want to just start with like super brief intros, like 40 seconds, and then we can just say what's the problem with transparent blockchains? Just kick things off, like some of the initial set of issues.
Okay.
No, yeah, that'd be excellent. All right. Test. All right.
Perfect.
Hey guys, we have no moderator, so this is just going to be a very casual roundtable, but not just casual because privacy is incredibly important and one of those topics that doesn't get nearly enough attention. So we're just going to kick things off with some introductions, give you a little bit of background on ourselves, what brings us to the table. And James, if you want to start us off.
Sure. So thanks for that. My name is James Carlyle, and I'm starting a project with a small group of other people called Obscuro, which is building a confidential, privacy-preserving smart contract platform, L2, rolling up to Ethereum. And I've been in the space for about 6-7 years, but I spent 6 years working on enterprise blockchain software. So I'm coming back into Ethereum.
So my name's Carter Woetzel, work for the Secret Foundation, all things BD, all things grants program, wrote the gray paper for Secret Network, lead economist for Shade Protocol, which is launching a stablecoin called Silk, which is a really fun one. Be sure to check that out. So yeah, lots of building, lots of innovation happening in the world of privacy in the last year or two. So
I'm Kai, developer for RAILGUN. So we're looking at enabling privacy for existing smart contract chains. So there's already a fair amount of momentum on, say ETH or Polygon. Wouldn't it be great if you didn't have to move all of that over to another chain in order to be private?
That sounds great. Yes. I think actually we have a pretty rounded sort of quorum here because I'm working on a project called Manta Network, which is also in privacy, surprise, surprise. But it is specifically within the Polkadot ecosystem. So it is focused on privatizing parachain assets within the Polkadot and Kusama ecosystem. So, yeah, we're a pretty good variety up here.
yeah. So to kick things off, I just want to start with, what is the problem with totally transparent blockchains? How does that tangibly play out? And specifically, what are these privacy projects trying to solve in terms of end users, institutions, et cetera?
I'm going to take a stab at this from a commercial perspective. So I mentioned I worked on an enterprise blockchain, helped design something called Corda. And one of the focuses we had for Corda was private data and only sharing data with counterparties that were trading, so that in general you couldn't see the trading data unless you were involved in the transaction yourself. And that's really important from a commercial perspective, because obviously commercial organizations want to trade in private because they want to deal with each other. They don't want their deals to be made public. But I guess, and maybe we'll come on to sort of philosophy of privacy as well. I think privacy matters fundamentally. It matters, although people say, if I'm doing nothing nefarious, I don't care if people see what I'm doing. I think it's more fundamental than that.
Totally. I think it's so interesting to me that when blockchain started off, total transparency was like this feature, and it became this complete dichotomy of either total transparency or you're something like Monero that's like a black box and like is bad and evil and all these things. But it just seems to me that in order to bring Web3 to the next level, there has to be granularity. There has to be sovereignty for builders to decide how much privacy there is for an application. Like if you wanted to build a decentralized Uber app, if you did that on like Ethereum with no privacy, your location's always publicly visible. It's just sitting in the JSON file for anyone to grab. It's just metadata. So it seems like we need that granularity and choice to bring Web3 to end users in the way that we all envision and dream of.
Yeah, I kind of want to build on that because two things that you said that really resonated. One is when blockchain was first, I guess, introduced through Bitcoin in around the Halloween time, right? Like the idea of privacy wasn't really there beyond like pseudo anonymity, right? So like your wallet address would be your level of privacy, and at that time it was like good enough, right? But like at the time, I don't think like Satoshi Nakamoto was thinking, well, if I build this, someone else is going to build this thing called smart contracts, and it's going to be a Turing complete environment, and then people are going to interact with actual applications on top of that, right? And so like, you know, I understand the original philosophy of Bitcoin and like pure transaction focus in a peer-to-peer manner, but you know, things have definitely evolved since that time, and I think like definitely needs are evolving as well. And the other thing that you mentioned with like privacy and granularity, right? Like I think like one of the core, at least one thing that I'm really like passionate about is like privacy should not be a luxury, right? And like if you think about Web 2.0, right, like privacy feels like a luxury in the sense that the user experience is designed in a way that doesn't allow or doesn't make privacy very easy to use, right? Like if you go to a website, you can either click accept all cookies, right, which is this super big convenient button, or you can like select from the list of all the cookies they provide and like you can like deselect each of them, and it takes like 5 minutes to deselect everything just to watch like a 3-second video clip, right? So like the privacy isn't really built into Web 2, but I think like right now, right, like we have the opportunity to build privacy into Web 3. And so like back to the granularity point, like privacy doesn't have to be in everything, but at least privacy should be an option, right? Yeah.
I think
Sure. I kind of like your point about pseudonymity, but I think pseudonymity, when it comes to the Web 2 space, you could make the argument that maybe that's good enough. But when it comes to Web 3, one of the side effects of having everything, you know, permanently out there and permanently verifiable is if you know, you could be really good with not linking your identities, but all it takes is one slip, and now you've retroactively destroyed your privacy, you know, for years, right? And then the cost to go and like migrate yourself over and then set up a new identity and everything, that's it's a lot harder to do that in the kind of Web3 space, right? In Web 2, I can just kind of go in and just wipe my account or something, and that's it. But Web 3 is, you know, it's permanent, and so privacy, you know, strong privacy is an especially interesting topic when it comes to Web3.
Yeah, I was going to say, coming back to a point that Alex made earlier, you know, I think if we're going to take DeFi to the next 8 billion people, privacy matters. What I see, for example, with ENS, ETH names, is that the pioneers are happy for their transactions, or at least some of them, to be fully tied to their identity. But I'd say most people are not, and even for myself, I don't want the world knowing what my bank transactions are, what I'm spending my money on. I think, you know, for anyone to come across into DeFi, they're going to expect that level of privacy themselves.
I totally agree. Even like totally transparent stable coins. Like if I went to go and buy an ice cream cone with a stable coin and I buy it, that person knows my entire essentially bank balance and every transaction I've ever made since the beginning of time. I mean, that's not sustainable. That's like to achieve the original vision of truly peer-to-peer transactions, there has to be some sort of on-chain privacy and hopefully a path to off-chain auditability and compliance. That seems to be the end state for Web3. That would be the ideal place. But so far, it doesn't seem like that's like necessarily a shared vision across the entire blockchain ecosystem. So my question is, why has the privacy narrative not gained more traction in your guys' eyes? And maybe you disagree. Maybe you think privacy has all the traction right now. But
I think it's just because privacy is really, really difficult, and there's so many avenues of attack. You know, like you're looking at there's a classical example of trying to secure like AES encryption algorithms on a CPU. There's one of two operations that it can do, and one of the attacks against it is if you watch the power draw on the CPU, you can figure out which operation it's doing, and like decrypt out the key. And like from a programming perspective, right? Like I'm just writing the code. Like I'm not thinking about what the hardware's doing, like what circuits on the board are live or not. And so, you know, there's like this workaround that I have to do as like just someone that wants to write code. You know, I have to compute both branches and then select which one, and then intentionally make my code less efficient in order to gain privacy. And there's just so many attack vectors at every branch of this, every kind of layer of the stack, that I think privacy just it's too difficult to do with the pace of innovation that we're seeing in DeFi.
So it's almost like it's the end state, but there's a reason it's the end state that we're all trying to head towards, is because of the level of complexity. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's another reason why maybe we haven't focused on privacy so much, and that's because pioneers don't care. I mean, in general, I don't think they care if people know that they're buying NFTs or whatever. That they're thought leaders in the community. In a way, they want people to see what they're doing. So I think there's a sort of, I guess there's a sort of philosophical issue as well as a technical issue.
I think also it's a user experience issue, right? Like it's already, I mean, you know, I think like the innovation that's happening is great, but like it's super intimidating to just like move my funds from like Ethereum to a layer 2 like Polygon, right? Like, and this is coming from someone who's been in the space for years. I'm just like kind of nervous, don't know when it's going to arrive, you know, and the whole time I'm just like, don't worry guys, I'll be there in a minute, but still staring at the screen, right? And so like privacy's user experience is not really that different right now, because like just with everything in Web3, we're all in a highly experimental phase. We're building on bleeding edge technology, right? And so it doesn't make for the perfect user experience. Inevitably, you still have to use wallet addresses, and I think like there's a lot of mental friction involved in trying to adopt new technologies, right? Like I think like there are certain pushes right now, such as with like DeFi, right? Like the return rates on DeFi, et cetera, are like motivating people to, you know, potentially be more willing to take that risk. But privacy, you know, especially, you know, going back to Web 2.0 in a condition where you're thinking about, okay, well, you know, in Web 2.0, my privacy was kind of taken care of. I never really thought about it. So why should I think about it in Web 3.0, right? Like the friction there, like I think right now is a little bit higher because the user experience doesn't match up with exactly what their expectation of returned value would be.
Yeah, it's hard enough to create good user experiences with just plain public Web3.
I think there's an argument to be made, and I think that the privacy community can do a better job of talking about like the narrative of like privacy as utility. So the example I like to give is like minor extractable value. Like the front running problem is like $1 billion problem right now, and it's only getting worse. And it's because blockchains are completely transparent. You thought single chain MEV was bad. Wait until multi-chain MEV starts to enter the picture. And these are problems that can be solved by privacy. Like if you make DEXs with privacy incorporated into the smart contract, people can't front run like that, like very easily. It's like it's way more complicated and way more expensive for them to try to do it. So I think we need to also do a better job of like educating the larger world that it's not just like privacy is like this nice feature in hiding your identity, but also is like your lack of privacy is costing you money and like within the world of DeFi potentially, and you don't even know about it.
Yeah, it's interesting, you know, this issue with front running MEV. So Chair Gensler of the SEC has taken aim at the DeFi protocols and you know, Wild West tokens and stuff, but actually that is a concern of regulators as well. That you know, they are worried about this because it's manipulation of end users. It's and it's fundamentally against what I guess the SEC stands for. So it's almost like privacy can help bring DeFi into sort of acceptance and perhaps negate some of that sort of negative impression that the regulators have.
Actually, yeah, that, you know, talking about regulation, it just and nothing specific about regulation, but like more so just thinking about the whole sentiment towards privacy, right? Like when Bitcoin first came out, right, especially in the cypherpunk sort of audiences, it got this narrative of like, okay, the only reason you would ever use Bitcoin is to buy drugs or do other bad things, right? And now, obviously, the sentiment of Bitcoin has kind of changed, right? Whether it's digital gold or like it will be future transaction globally or whatever. You know, I'm not here to dispute that, but what I want to say is like right now, the sentiment around privacy is in the early stages as well, right? And we see that same sort of sentiment where people are like, oh, the only reason you would need privacy is if you're going to do bad things, right? Which is exactly what we heard about Bitcoin like years ago. But no, that's not true at all, right? I think that people just take for granted all the things in their lives right now that have some type of inherent level of privacy that they just don't have to worry about, right? But with Web3, the permanence of data, right? Like it's definitely going to be a huge problem.
Yeah, it's not just the permanence of data. It's also the way that firms are able to string data together, and I don't underestimate the degree to which authorities already understand, even if perhaps users believe that their transactions are pseudonymous, the authorities have de-anonymized those because they're using tools to link all this activity together.
I'm just imagining, Facebook dropping me a couple of ads based on my purchasing history at coffee shops or something.
I think it's interesting too, like on the institution side, like you can look up Whale API on Ethereum and you can watch every single massive transaction happening on chain. And one thing with like institution and VCs, like if they have trading strategies on chain, people are copying them. So even like protection of alpha, if you have asymmetry of information and you have a certain strategy, when people are able to copy that because everything's transparent, you lose that alpha. You lose that yield on your investment strategy. So there's workarounds to this, but they're very expensive, right? We got to spin up all these wallets, have to like properly seed things. And more from what I've heard, like there's a lot of OTC trade happening because we can't truly achieve the volume on chain that we want from some of these institutions because there's no privacy. So in my mind, unlocking the next massive layer of value in DeFi comes with privacy. And I don't know if that narrative is going to take like 2 years for it to play out, or 4 years, or 5 years before like we're going to realize that the barrier to pulling in the real money, like the pension funds of the world on chain, like there has to be another step of security and privacy involved with that.
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to the whole cost of disruption in migrating things over in a pseudonymous paradigm on chain. Like if I'm an institution and I'm say I've got my alpha, I've executed my trading strategy. There'll be some period of time before, of course, you get front-running bots completely destroying my profit margins. And then, so what might have been giving me say 10% a week ago will only be giving me say 1%. So I've got my loss on the decline there. And then I've also got my loss in the downtime where I'm not trading, because it isn't just a simple matter of taking my funds and moving it to a different address. It's easy to track. I've got to go and say move it to find some like large centralized exchange with enough volume and kind of use that as a mixer and then pull it out slowly so that it's not obvious that I've just put it in, pulled it straight back out. And the amount of disruption there is just it's massive, right? You can't expect you can't expect like institutions to invest the amount of time that they do into generating trading strategies when the amount like value that they get extract from them is next to nothing.
Yeah, I think definitely on the institutional side, there's a lot of problems, especially the larger the amount of assets you're moving, the harder it is, the more friction there is, definitely. But I think like a point that you made about Facebook, I do want to bring it back to like the consumer level as well, right? Like, and this is just like a really specific example. Facebook, I don't know how many of you guys know, right? They have these things called shadow profiles, where like even if you don't use Facebook, like I deleted my Facebook account a few years ago, but I know they have more data on me and they know more about me than my mom does, right? But like the whole point of shadow profiles is that they use data from actual Facebook users to create the profiles of people that don't use Facebook, right? And so they probably know more about those people than if they were your best friend, right? It's just like, my analogy with my mom. But the problem though is like, I don't even remember, was it like a year ago or maybe 2 years ago? I don't know, time's a blur, but like this thing called Cambridge Analytica, right? Like it exploded. And why did Cambridge Analytica explode? Because all of a sudden people were entirely pissed because like, someone had unauthorized access to their data and they're doing something with their data. Honestly, I have no idea what Cambridge Analytica is doing with my data, but it doesn't even matter what they're doing with my data. I'm pissed because they have my data. And so it's like, I think that's the general sentiment, right? Like people are angry and about their data being exposed and being linked, being analyzed in a manner that they didn't authorize. But like when you look into Web3, it's no longer about Facebook having your data or Cambridge Analytica having your data. It's about me having your data or him having your data, right? Like literally everyone in this room probably has an internet connection that has your data, right? And so we can all become Cambridge Analytica. And I don't think that's a world we want, right?
Sure. I mean, that is actually a pretty scary thought, because the sort of actors that have the resources to put together profiles like the Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, like that's a pretty high barrier to entry at the moment. But you know, with everyone having access to that, that's like, okay, just some random guy off the street can recognize me and come over and like hit me with a wrench until I give my give my private keys over, because he knows I've got, you know, like $1 million in like sheep or something.
Yeah, and I mean that's already happening. I mean, Chainalysis has like 95% coverage of all trading volume on like Bitcoin and Ethereum. So when people like when you're using those things, like you're being watched 100%. It's already happening.
Yeah, I hope like Chainalysis isn't the one that's going to hit you on the head with a wrench, but like the whole, but I think like the threat is definitely very real, right? We've already kind of seen that with, I think it was in Canada. Also a couple, I don't know, like it's all a blur. Cambridge Analytica, Canada, the invention of Facebook, it's all like one time period now. It's the past, but it's happened, right? Like I don't know if the individual was actually murdered or just extremely hurt, but they had their crypto assets stolen from them because the person had figured out how much that they actually held and went to their actual house, and I think held their entire family hostage.
There was I read this morning an article that appeared in Decrypt a year ago, but it was I was slow to it, but it was an article about how people were looking at ENS names and linking them to the ENS, the ETH name purchase, and not the account that the ETH name was tied to, but the account that paid for it. And so they did some very simple detective work to figure out, you know, who holds a lot of accounts that sit behind these names, and the names are easily identifiable. So you know, once you've got a starting point like that, you can sort of work backwards through and pull together entire histories. It's kind of scary.
I guess that does speak to a sort of optics or like a psychological kind of perception problem when it comes to say privacy on ETH, right? You know, if I've got like my username on Twitter or whatever, or like my ENS name, and that's very clearly tied to my identity, and you know, I'm very careful about what I put on there because I know it's strongly tied to my identity. But you know, I might not be so careful if like I just look at my ETH address and it's 0x123ABC. Like that's not, I don't like recognize that as something that's tied to my identity as closely as something that you know is like got a username or a kind of personalized thing attached to it. But you know, from like a data mining perspective, there really isn't much difference, right? It's probably even easier to
even more unique.
Yeah, because it's more unique, right? And you know, it's a literal cryptographic hash of the private key that I'm using, the public key that I'm using to like carry out all these actions. Like you couldn't ask for a better identifier.
So I want to talk about something slightly different, which is authority, law enforcement, and privacy. Because like, you know, you mentioned Zcash and Monero, and there's this sort of assertion that people working in this space are shadowy supercoders. There's a perception that, you know, people are trying to do nefarious things if they're trying to keep things private. And my question is, I suppose, how should any privacy technology, whether it's blockchain related or whether it's even you know, chat or something else that's end-to-end encrypted, how should that relate to or deal with demands from law enforcement agencies?
I guess at least for secret networks tech stack, we have something called viewing keys. So users are able to decrypt their own transactions and like hand it off to an auditor if they need be, and they can have granular control over who has access to that viewing key. So there's like total flexibility on the access controls to the decryption process of like the contract interactions and like your transaction itself. So I think like, at least for this tech stack, like there's a pretty good straightforward path. We'll see how like regulators and auditors react to, because it's still sovereignty at the end of the day. Like you have to make the decision to do that or hand that off to someone else, which is why I think endgame is KYC platforms plug into something like that type of infrastructure. And then we do have a path to, you know, auditors being like, okay, cool, we can play ball with this. But you're correct. The current problem is like if you have like a privacy tech that doesn't have a path to that, it's like that narrative just seems to be what like media will try to do to you right away. So I'm curious how what is the workaround of that? Is that just like a public perception thing? Is that like privacy chains need to do a better job of working together to change that public perception? I mean, I think it's a question at large for sure.
Yeah, I think that's a fairly common approach among most privacy protocols to kind of have like the viewing key or like an exportable, like verifiable transaction log, and that does kind of make sense if you try and draw an analog to, you know, something in the physical world, right? Like with mail or something, right? Like by default, like it's only for me to read, but I can selectively show it to you or you or you, right? So that kind of gives me a bit more control. And, you know, if perhaps like authorities came over and said, oh, we'd like to we think you ordered a few ounces or something in the mail, can we inspect it, right? There's the optionality there, but I think it has to be private by default with the option of generating something verifiable.
Do you think platforms should always retain sovereignty with the user rather than have some kind of backdoor to authority, to law enforcement agencies?
Sovereignty, every time.
I think a couple of thoughts. One, directly to your question about, you know, sovereignty. I think it's already played out, right? Like, I mean, it's played out in history, right? With HTTPS and HTTP, right? Like the whole idea of introducing HTTPS to internet surfing and providing more security on the individual level, right? And then, like, I think the original idea was, hey, let's put some backdoors so that the government can at least spy on everyone and, you know their activities or whatnot. But I think like the conclusion as we know it, right? Who knows if the NSA actually did anything? But the idea here is like, okay, this is fully self-sovereign, right? HTTPS has no known backdoors. And so I think that can definitely play into the Web3 space as well. I think, you know, the second point kind of flows into this is like, you know, it goes at the fundamental philosophy of Web3, right? And one of those philosophies that I think, you know, isn't truly really discussed as much is like responsibility. Who's ultimately responsible, right? When you're the one that holds your private keys, when you're the one that has access to all of your information, right? When you are the only one that can authorize a transaction, right? Like we're really shifting the authority and the responsibility from centralized organizations and centralized companies to a very decentralized manner. And that's more philosophical than it is like technological, although it is like, you know, technological as well. And so like I think like things like self-auditing are definitely like adherent to, you know, compliance in a Web 3.0 space, right? And, you know, full disclosure, we're doing self-auditing as well, right? But like self-auditing is not something that we can just say, okay, hey, XYZ guy, we're just going to audit your stuff right now, right? Because that defeats the whole point of decentralization. And so I do think that there needs to be a balance. And, you know, yesterday's talk with Hester, right, when she was on the big screen, she had mentioned something about this sort of this intersection of regulation and innovation, right? Because it has to, we have to march in step with one another, in the sense that, you know, like regulation, people, they're not here to like destroy the world, right? Like, I mean, regulation is definitely needed because there's got to be some form of, you know, keeping the good actors safe. But at the same time, right, like regulation and how it potentially could stifle innovation, I don't think that, I personally don't think that, and I think that everyone here agrees that like there is no Web 3.0 space where privacy is not there, right? Because like it just makes no sense. Why the heck would anyone order parts with Bitcoin? Like why would Tesla ever order parts with Bitcoin if it knew that as soon as it made the Bitcoin transaction, every other competitor sees where they're ordering from, how much they ordered, what price they got, et cetera, et cetera. It just makes no sense at all, right? And so, you know, having that scalable vision for Web3 requires some level of privacy. And that level of privacy, in order to fit into the Web3 vision, requires some type of self-sovereignty.
I mean, one of the things that's been bothering me is actually something that Hester said yesterday, which was that developers of technology have to consider how it's being used. You know, there's an ethical issue here as well. And I guess this has always applied to new technologies, including, you know, splitting the atom and you know, and so on. And we know all about that. And so a question I ask myself is, well, okay, I'm building a privacy solution. How would I feel if I knew that people are using it for illegal activity? I mean, that's not what I set out to do. Is that a sort of an unfortunate consequence? There's 99% good and 1%, you know, problematic activity, and do I live with it, or do I have to do more than that?
If you ever make something that represents value and can transfer value, you can never escape that paradigm. So if you make any form of currency, in my mind, like that problem will always be there, right? And then you add on privacy to it, and it's, you know, it's the double whammy. But I don't know how you work your way around it. If you want to be someone who designs a currency, there will probably be people who use it for the wrong reasons, for the wrong things. But I feel you. Like, that is something that privacy people have to think about.
I mean, I guess it's a balance between, you know, is there legitimate use that people are deriving from it, and I think, you know, if you're benefiting like a large amount of people, which I think privacy solutions on Web3 definitely are, then I don't think it's right to deprive you know, the general populace of access to a very beneficial tool if a small subset might use it for the wrong reasons.
Yeah. So one approach I'm thinking of is the time value of privacy, or the value of privacy over time and how it degrades. And in the UK, we have statute that says that all state secrets should be revealed after a period of time which they're just of historical interest. So, you know, why did politicians act the way they did 30 years ago, or during the Cold War, or you know, other wars that, for example, the UK has been involved with? And so we talked earlier about MEV. So MEV, of course, the value of the privacy is very short term. It dissipates almost immediately. The privacy associated with personal actions lasts, or is valuable for much longer. But I wonder if there's a solution here which, and one of the things that we're thinking about for Obscuro is revealing after a period of time, not revealing on the demands of authority, because that's a highly political decision about whether it's a legitimate authority that's requesting information or not. And I would never want to be involved in the decision making there. But just a sort of a blanket approach that says, okay, well, after a certain amount of time, things will be revealed, so you can't escape prosecution. But and it diminishes the, if you like, the value of the solution, but it addresses this problem, maybe.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a sliding scale on that point, right? Because you've got a couple of factors that play into how valuable it is to keep something private, and how interesting, or like how valuable it is to make that public. I mean, it's probably not that valuable for someone to see, you know, how many shots of espresso I drink a day. Probably ever, right? But again, when it comes to your example of the UK government, you know, that's probably very valuable from a historical perspective to eventually have that revealed. I guess the difficulty there is, you know, as a developer, it's pretty difficult to kind of foresee how the usage of your system is going to play out, and try and figure out, you know, where is that threshold where keeping this thing private becomes less valuable than making it public. That's just the difficulty that I kind of foresee with that.
Yeah, and I think, like, you know, I think the idea that the path that you're going down definitely makes a lot of sense depending on the type of user you're trying to, get to adopt, right? Like, for example, institutional level, right? Like, I think that sort of compliance is something that they're very comfortable with, right? But if you're talking about more of like a general population, more general Web3, right? Like, I think that's a little tricky, because like it like there's this like I don't know if you guys use Reddit, but like there's a subreddit called Blunder Years, and and it's just people posting photos of themselves when they were teenagers or kids. And especially right now, most of those photos are kids dressing up in their mom's like black overcoats with like 90s shades and thinking that they're in the Matrix, right? And this is something that if you saw this photo of yourself, it's not something you want to share with the rest of the world, right? And so I think it's a very contrived example, but it just shows that like there are things in human nature, or there are things to being human where we do things that we regret. It could be as trivial as wearing Matrix style outfits, or it could be something about like, oh shoot, I don't want my college admissions person to realize that when I was like 16 I had done this thing or interacted with that application or something that they don't necessarily stand with, right? Like or I don't know, I'm whatever, right? But like there can be a lot of examples on the consumer level in which like even with a timed release, despite the fact that maybe the government, it's not targeted for the use of the government, but it could be very targeted for the use of my friends now know what I did when I was 16. And it's just a history I didn't want to necessarily remember.
So I'll posit a question. Let's say we go 5 years from now and we look back on what will we say about the current state of privacy and blockchain when we look back at this time in history, about a decade after the inception of Bitcoin, or more than a decade, of course. But
I'd say thank God we're looking at the problem right now, because like 5 years from now, right? If the people in this room or myself, right, like really believe in Web3 and what it can truly be, right, then 5 years from now it's going to be radically different than it is today, right? Like just thinking about all the bull runs, right? Because like not even looking at the money side, but the innovation that comes from bull runs, right? Like I mean the one before the most recent one, I mean it was like Bitcoin forks and all that stuff, and then it became about like smart contracts and Turing completeness and all these decentralized applications. And during that phase, literally everyone was just like, imagine decentralized Uber, right? Like it was like every conversation. And now it's about like decentralized finance and NFTs and metaverse, et cetera, right? But like with every sort of bull run, there's a spur of innovation that comes out with new ideas, many of which they fall below the wayside, but some that survive, and that brings on more use cases, more users, more data. And so I think looking 5 years from now, I can't even imagine. I'm not like a trend predictor here, but like I can say for certainty that like I think that there's going to be a lot more use cases then than there is now. And I think people are going to be really concerned about how they interact with those use cases, because we had actually, before we set out to build Manta, we had actually done this study. 400, we got like 400 responses, right? And these are from traders, institutions, angel investors, et cetera, and we just tried to quantify exactly how they thought about privacy. And 75% of them, right, already said that they either have hesitated to make a transaction in the past, or altogether just didn't make a transaction because they were concerned about their privacy and what it would imply after the transaction happened, right? And so like if it's already a huge concern right now, just like I can't imagine what it'd be 5 years from now. So I think like ultimately I'm glad we're looking at the problem right now.
There's you mentioned your survey suggesting privacy matters to people. So I think that I know we're not necessarily sort of fans of huge fans of CDBCs, maybe if you listened to Alex earlier, but the ECB did a survey of amongst its population, a very large survey of what people wanted to see in a digital currency, and the largest single thing they want was privacy. So it's an inhibitor if it doesn't exist. What do I think DeFi is going to bifurcate into sort of more regulated side and less regulated side, and the more regulated side is going to follow a regulation that includes AML. AML requires KYC, identity becomes important. I think we were hearing about it, Aave Arc. from Stanley. And I think, ironically, KYC and regulation is going to drive the need for privacy, because once you've got the strong identity, then privacy becomes more important.
Yeah, and actually, that brings up a good point. And I don't know if this is like the Webster's dictionary definition, but this is kind of how I separate it, right? Like, there's a difference between privacy and anonymity, right? Like, and I think like with KYC and AML, right? Like, what you're really trying to, I guess, for lack of a better term, get rid of is anonymity. You can't anonymously do things, right? But at the same time, it doesn't forgo privacy, because even after AML KYC, right, there can still be a layer of privacy. And I think like this is kind of getting into the realm of like what we're doing with the self-auditing, right? Because like if an institution, if a government decides that, okay, this person is behaving suspiciously, they can still identify this person and say, hey, give us your audit, right, of all the private transactions. And with the self-auditing process, you can still do that. And so I think there is sort of a balance where KYC, AML can still exist, whereas privacy can coexist.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say I totally agree with that angle. And it's interesting to think that like privacy started off as this narrative of like, danger, but then like 5 years from now, it actually might be the thing that empowers Web 2 to fully transition to Web 3. It is a requirement, actually. Yeah. So I think we'll look back on the first 10, 15 years and be like, why the heck did we think we could do it without privacy? What were we thinking? Why was that just like right over everyone, just building like perfectly transparent blockchains without like really good privacy solutions? Like it was so apparent. So I'm honored to be on a stage with other people that like value that and see that vision. And I hope we can get as many people in this room understanding the value of privacy. We could also open things up for questions too. I don't know where we're at for time. Would you guys be open to that? Okay.
We got thumbs up from the booth.
Say privacy, you're able to see stuff. Leading up to that, like privacy complications are very expensive. It gas costs a bunch of gas. Earlier you were mentioning how when you're coding privacy code, you have to keep in mind hardware requirements and how that interacts with the code that you're writing. Also, when you learn on ZK Snarks, you learn about this like ceremony where you're destroying waste to make sure that you have a ceremony to perform these actions. It seems like privacy is both computationally intense, coordination intense, as well as very difficult to achieve. Like all of the privacy technologies out there are, spending a lot of time on development. Computation is very expensive. Do you guys foresee some sort of Moore's law level of like technological development and innovation in which the speed of privacy development increases in some sort of spectrum leading up to that, end state that we all see? Because I feel like with crypto, you roughly know what you want in the future. It's just getting there is like sort of this ideal that's like really hard to achieve.
So for anyone in the back who couldn't hear that, the question is about the scalability of like privacy, because generally speaking, it's computationally expensive and coordinating, privacy layer technologies is difficult. So just for anyone who couldn't necessarily hear.
There are people listening on video as well, or watching on video.
Perfect. I can go and take a first stab at it. I just want to make some clarifying statements. First of all, right, with zero knowledge proofs and ceremonies that you mentioned. So zero knowledge proofs themselves it's not a technology. It's sort of like a methodology. And so within the methodology, there are different approaches to creating a zero knowledge proof. And some of these methodologies require a ceremony. Some actually don't. And for example, Plonk, right, a new implementation of zero knowledge proofs. And so I only say this because this is kind of a demonstration of the Moore's law sort of statement that you made, right? And at the end of the day, I think Moore's law is just a fancy way of saying very smart people working together really hard to find a solution to a problem, right? And so like, the existence, the lack of a necessity for ceremonies in zero knowledge proofs these days, I think, is already a sentiment towards the fact that we're driving in the right direction towards innovation and technology for privacy. And then on top of that, right, like you had mentioned like hardware considerations as well. I know like with like trusted execution environments, definitely. I don't know as much as you guys do, so I won't comment on that. But in terms of like the cost of computation and exactly how we get to the end state, yes, this is a really good question, because we know what the end state looks like and we're over here, but like there is no paved road, right? It's just a bushel of, I know, thorny bushes. And so that's why there's 4 people sitting on stage and not like 50. But the cost, I think, is definitely a factor, right? Because cost, at the end of the day, it's not even about the transaction and the money, but more so about the concept that if costs are high, privacy is not a utility. Privacy is a luxury, right? And so I think that's also why, like, we're building as layer 2s, we're building as entirely different networks, we're building on other networks, right? So like we're all trying to figure out a solution to accommodate and make privacy work in a more frictionless manner. And I think we're all taking like very different approaches to that. So like we're all kind of stumbling in the dark, trying to find the doorknob that opens to that door of light. And so hopefully at least some of us will get there.
Can you comment on let's say proof generation and how computationally expensive, the trend for computational expense over the last five, I think 10 years, but mostly in the last 5 years?
Oh man, I can't throw out numbers, but what I'll say is that like at least for us, right? Like I know that Tornado Cash uses like really a browser implementation of zero knowledge proofs, right? And I think like the cost of the implementation, yes, one is on the computation side, but other is just like, the implementation of the underlying layer 1 of Ethereum, right? And the gas fees associated there. But I think like the speed overall has definitely, in terms of generation, has definitely been improving, not just because of code optimization, but also because of hardware optimization, right? So like hardware improvements, I know like, okay, I won't get into too much detail for lack of time, but yeah, like it's definitely getting better.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a sort of matter of exploring where the trade-offs lie, and the fact that we're up here on stage, just sort of means that research into so historically cryptography research has moved very, very slow. Looking into things like ECDSA and so on. But once we got things like Bitcoin and all, we had a very big economic incentive to look into this thing more, and we saw a huge explosion of innovation in sort of traditional cryptography, and I think we're sort of starting to see the same thing happen when it comes to privacy preserving technologies. The original kind of or the first sort of usable zero knowledge proving system, maybe Sigma protocols, or I think probably it's Grok 16, which is what Tornado uses. And more recently, we've got Plonks. We had Starks come out, and that originally started out as very, very computationally expensive, but it's sort of come down to the realm of possible to implement. And just the pace of innovation, I don't know, even over the past year, has just picked up big time.
Yeah, and I generally speaking, I feel like whenever there's a problem, the more demand there is to solve the problem, the quicker it gets solved, just as a general rule of thumb. So I think the fact that we're starting to see even like very distinct progress on like actual implementations of privacy solutions is proving that there is demand for this, and that's only going to continue to grow. I do think every privacy solution is like as a scale of security, right? And there's a level of risk involved with any type of implementation. And I think we're seeing like speed to market with like hardware level encryption, which is technically the most scalable, probably has the most security assumptions. So I think the maximal security solutions take the longest to develop. I mean, that's going to be a lifelong generational legacy type problem to solve. And I think then there's a spectrum in between where we're just trying to get privacy to market as fast as possible in an implementation that works and is secure. So I'm excited to see the full spectrum of privacy play out. I always like to talk about like security maximalism isn't good in a space that's already 98% transparent. So we should be applauding every privacy solution to the best of our ability and pushing each other to continue to improve. And I think that'll happen because the demand is there.
what we're doing uses hardware-based privacy, I guess, trusted execution environments, and these they do come under some criticism because they have been exploited in lab environments. It's proven that we're working with Intel. Every so often, Intel has to provide a patch. From a computation perspective, they're very effective. You know, there's no massive overhead in terms of doing computation inside an enclave. So that's not a problem. The problem we have to solve in the protocol is how ultimately do we maintain integrity of the ledger and sanctity and protect assets if there has been some kind of breach. Because it's one thing to lose privacy, but it's another thing to lose integrity.
Are we running out of time here? All right, I just want to say thank you also to the event organizers. They have been incredible. So if you could do a round of applause for all the hard workers here today. Thank you.